Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Hudson Institute's Olympic Boycott series. I'm Nina Shea. I'm a senior scholar here at the Hudson Institute, and I also direct the Center for Religious Freedom, which is sponsoring this series. The International Olympic Committee has bestowed on the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, a propaganda opportunity to present a perfect image of itself, even as religious genocide is ongoing against the Uyghurs and other ethnic Muslims in Xinjiang. This is unprecedented. We aim to keep the focus on the CCP's genocide and other atrocities through a 4-part deep dive discussions with some of the world's top experts on religious persecution in China. Part 1 was a behind the scenes look at the US Secretary of State's genocide decision last year with his principal policy advisor on China. And you can see that still at www.hudson.org. Today's discussion will examine the tactics used in Beijing's cover-up of its human rights abuses and overcoming the challenges this presented by such deception and opaqueness. My guests are 3 noted reporters and analysts. Gordon Chang is the author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great US-China Tech War. Gordon lived and worked as a lawyer in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades with the firms Paul Weiss and Baker and McKenzie. You can follow him on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. Gulchera Hoja is an Uyghur American journalist who has worked for Radio Free Asia since 2001. In November 2019, Hoja received the Magnitsky Human Rights Award for her reporting on the ongoing human rights crisis in Xinjiang. And in 2020, Gulchera received the Courage in Journalism Award from the International Women's Media Foundation. And she was recently featured by the Washington Post for being among the top 10 journalists covering world crises. Ethan Gutman is a China analyst and human rights investigator and is a senior research fellow in China studies for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He is co-founder of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China. In 2017, Ethan was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. His book, The Slaughter, Mass Killings, Organ Harvesting, and China's Secret Solution to its Dissident Problem, was released in 2014. He also co-authored the influential 2016 investigative report, Bloody Harvest, The Slaughter, an Update. And he is currently working on a new book based on his personal interviews with Uyghur and Kazakh refugees across Central Asia. Welcome. So, even before the Olympics started, we were treated to a very enthusiastic US athlete in Beijing, talking about giving a tour of her bed, of her remote control bed that was provided by Beijing for all the athletes, and saying how China has really one-upped Japan in this Olympics. So we're going to expect a lot more of this. China is certainly benefiting from the Olympics. It is polishing its image, the CCP's image. There is a lot not being said. Everything is not being, there's nothing being said about its brutality and the atrocities that are also ongoing in China. So Gordon, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about this, about what China is doing, what Beijing is doing, the CCP behind the scenes to keep this golden image of itself. So could you start us off?
Well, thank you so much, Nina. Beijing is not only trying to polish its image, it is going for what political warfare specialist Kerry Gershanik and China watcher Cleo Pascal called, quote, global totalitarian thought control. And as you point out, they've been very successful at this. And the question is, how could they do this? Well, there are 5 things that I want to look at. First of all, China lies. Second, China is using its coercive power to jail journalists and others. Third, this is related, but it is different. China is denying access to people to look at what's going on in Xinjiang and other places. Fourth, China is pushing its narratives obsessively, and because of that, it is overwhelming discussions. And fifth, China is trying to use its global economic power to intimidate others and to demand loyalty. And there's one other thing, and we'll get to that later. So let's get started. The first thing, China lies. And it not only lies, it has big lies. So for instance, is China maintaining concentration camps? No. I mean, we're told that these are, quote, vocational training centers. Do Uyghurs love the motherland? Yes, of course, Beijing says. And also, of course, nobody is being tortured, raped, or killed in these concentration camps. But there are also other ways that Beijing shapes this narrative. So for instance, it calls its border area in the Northwest not Xinjiang province, but it calls it the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And the same thing is true about Tibet, which is another autonomous region. But of course, there's nothing autonomous about that. Second of all, I think the Communist Party gets its way because it's been jailing reporters, it's been jailing citizen journalists and social media posters. Also, it has been enticing and kidnapping people from other countries, bringing them back to China. So for instance, China's been issuing red notices for people. And you have talked about a number of these cases where people have been actually put into China's black jails in places like Dubai, Nina, which is a really important story. Also,
Gordon, can you tell our viewers what are red notices and black jails?
A red notice is something that Interpol issues. It puts its countries who are members on notice that China, for instance, wants a Uyghur. And so it's been able to do this. It did this, for instance, with a guy named Idris Hassan, who is now in a Moroccan jail because of a red notice pending transfer to Chinese authorities. So it's how China uses multilateral organizations to do its work for it, to try to get people who have escaped from Beijing or people just of general interest to China who are critics. And this is, and sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. But we do know that on occasion, as you pointed out, people actually are not brought back to China, but they're put into these secret facilities scattered around the world. And this repression has considerably worsened since Xi Jinping became Communist Party General Secretary in November 2012. The third thing, Xi Jinping is closing off Chinese society. His hero, Mao Zedong, did that in the first years of the People's Republic. And actually for 2 millennia, Chinese emperors did that. The effect of this is that we're just learning a lot less about what's going on in China. So for instance, at the end of January, the China Foreign Correspondents Club actually issued a report, its annual report. And in it, it talked about how reporters are just not getting access at all, and that many reporters are actually being turfed out of the country. And they had one other thing which was interesting. They said for those reporters who remained, they were subject to, quote, excessive intimidation, which sort of gives you the feeling that Beijing has normalized intimidation so that people think that there's some level of acceptable intimidation. But we're also seeing things, for instance, in terms of what Beijing is doing. So for instance, by denying access, it's denying access not just to reporters, but to the UN rights chief, Michelle Bachelet, who was not able to go to Xinjiang before the Olympics. And there's something that's even worse about this, in that the UN actually has intimidated a whistleblower, Emma Riley, who's complained about Bachelet not pressing China, not issuing, for instance, a report about Xinjiang before the Olympics. And while we're talking about the UN in terms of denying access, the other thing is, of course, we're seeing China try to control those multilateral institutions which have special voices. And that, of course, would be, for instance, the UN Human Rights Council, where China sits on. And China is using that to make sure that the Human Rights Council doesn't investigate what's going on in China. So again, that's another way that Beijing is denying access to the international community. We see, of course, on the fourth reason, China is actually overwhelming the truth. It does this by flooding newspapers and other traditional news outlets, movies, books, even video games. And China's made a special effort by recruiting Westerners. So for instance, it's got this YouTube channel now where Westerners maintain extolling the Communist Party. So China's creating its own media, and some people actually call this media washing. Beijing reinforces these messages through repetition and even more repetition. And we've seen this something very interesting in a related area. President Biden had his democracy summit in December. What Beijing did both before and after the summit was an unprecedented series of newspaper articles through Xinhua News Agency, People's Daily, China Daily, all of its media outlets. And even today, when people have forgotten about the democracy summit, Beijing is still pouring out press releases and news stories. Now, one can argue that this is counterproductive for China because it is continuing to bring to the attention of people something that they would not actually hear. But nonetheless, this is effective. And we've seen this, for instance, in the comments of Chamath Palihapitiya, who recently said, well, nobody cares about the Uyghurs.
That's the billionaire who's the partial owner of a sports
the Golden State Warriors,
yeah,
and a well-known person in Silicon Valley. The thing about Palihapitiya is that in even more chilling words, which didn't get very much attention, he said that the human rights situation in America was no better than China's. So really what we're seeing is Beijing being successful in shaping narratives. Mm-hmm. And the fifth thing, since about the end of the first decade of the century, China has been trying to use its economic might to shape and obtain geopolitical goals. And of course, we see this with the Beijing Olympics. We see all sorts of American companies that are sponsoring the games, like Procter and Gamble, and Coca-Cola. But we also see companies speaking out. So for instance, Apple and Nike, which have no hesitation talking and lecturing the American people about social justice, equity, and all the rest of it. Well, they don't say anything when it comes to China except for praising the Beijing regime. And you see two companies that are especially active in lecturing us, Apple and Nike, actually taking advantage of slave and forced labor in China. And by the way, we're talking about slave and forced labor of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and others. So we're talking about racial and religious minorities. Mm-hmm. So money talks, and Beijing is trying to make sure that money talks in favor of the Chinese regime.
Great. Go ahead.
Just one other point. One other thing, and that is that Beijing already has receptive audiences. So this final point really is that you're looking at people around the world who want to be lied to. So this is Beijing with a very fertile audience. Beijing hasn't gotten its total global totalitarian thought control, but it's getting close. And the advances it's been making recently are really frightening.
So you're saying that it's giving a plausible denial to the people who want to continue developing relations with China for one reason or another, whether it's the Olympic Committee or businesses or Hollywood or sports teams or the Vatican for that matter.
All of the above.
Yeah, all of the above.
And more.
Gulchera, Gordon mentioned this new report that has come out right before the Olympics from the Foreign Correspondents Club in China, where virtually all of the ones that were surveyed said that their work was being hampered by China, that it didn't meet international standards. You were involved in the media before you left China. You are now a foreign correspondent who is a Uyghur Chinese and Chinese American, who is now outside of China, reporting on China. Can you talk about these issues? I mean, there is a saying that nothing is a good substitute for being on the ground and inside a country reporting. But I guess that depends on the conditions inside the country, because it may actually be more effective to be where you are outside of China reporting on China. Can you just address some of these issues for us?
Okay. We're happy to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. And yes, before I came to the United States, work for RFA, I was a TV host in Xinjiang TV. It's a major Chinese propaganda tool in Xinjiang. So everybody knows in the communist country, especially in China, no press freedom, no journalism, real journalism in China. Everything, including print and newspaper to TV, radio, everything worked for Chinese government's propaganda. So I decided to left the China because of even in 2000 we feel the pressure because Chinese government using more harsh policy toward the Uyghur people to assimilate Uyghur people and others. So what Uyghurs are facing today is genocide in every aspect of their lives. Never in my life I imagined to be witnessing a genocide, let alone a genocide carried out against your own people. It has been more than 5 years that we as Uyghur journalists at the RFA have been receiving no other news than the horrific description of the life of Uyghurs, full of pain, suffering, deaths, and slave labor, detention camps, prisons, you know. Since 2016, more than 3 million of Uyghurs and the other were brutally persecuted and interned in the concentration camp. Just because we have worked to expose the abuses that would otherwise be silenced by China's state-controlled media and CCP authorities, me and my Uyghur colleagues at RFA becoming the target of an authoritarian regime. 8 of Uyghur journalists' family members in the camps right now. The Chinese government is trying to silence us.
By taking it out on your families.
Yes. It has been 20 years since I have been reporting along with my colleagues at Radio Free Asia about systematic religious and ethnic persecution of Uyghurs and other groups in East Turkestan. The Chinese renamed as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region ever since its occupation in 1949. As we know from the history that human connection are very important part of the existence. They are like the roots of a tree that anchoring us into the depth of soil while allowing to grow up toward the sky. The life of Uyghurs, like that of other peoples, is established around these connections. And yet the Chinese government, which is determined to wipe us out as the other, the alien, and above all, the enemy from within, in precisely destroying these connections mercilessly. We know Xi Jinping using no mercy policy toward the Uyghurs.
Right, that he actually said that in a document that was leaked to the
Yes.
New York Times. It was, I guess, a closed door meeting of the CCP.
Yes. The Chinese government passed the anti-terrorism law on January 1st, 2016, and August of the same year enforced the anti-terrorism regulation on Uyghur territories, making it legal to consider religious extremism the ideological basis of terrorism. After its accusation, it expanded its positions by educating and promoting religious beliefs as mental illness and extremism. As a result, more than 3 million of Uyghurs and the others were brutally persecuted and interned in the concentration camps. In 2017, Chinese government has established a list of criteria by which the authorities would deem someone as extremist. Just to name a few, like growing beard, wearing a scarf, headscarf, like just like me, or long dress, have a religious book at home, even you name your children with Islamic name.
Mm-hmm.
So the Chinese government first targeted the religious scholars and practicing religious people. For example, Muhammad Salih Aji, one of the most respected religious scholar who translated the Quran into Uyghur, died at age of 82 in the camp early 2018. Recently, my colleagues confirmed an elderly Muslim Uyghur woman, Khalchem Pazil. She's 78 years old, serving a long jail sentence for participating in religious gathering. Just for that, she is only one of the 5 people from the family being persecuted. So it's still going on.
How do you, Chair, I'm going to ask you, how do you get this information? I mean, you can't go there. No one can go there. They're guided tours through Xinjiang that has, pulled the wool over the eyes of Muslim leaders in Muslim majority countries. And yet you are getting these detailed stories of what is happening behind this curtain. Can you tell us your methods? I mean, I guess some of them are printed in law. There's documents that have been leaked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was talking to the U.S. Congress in 2018. I was mentioned right now, every Uyghur family have someone who's jailed or being interned in the camps. So it's large scales of, targeting Uyghur people. That's why many of them have relatives or neighbors or somebody in the outside of China right now. Mm-hmm. They're using social media. If they find out something happened to their family, they immediately share with us all those years. So that's the most, the source for us right now. Before we can call the locals to find out what's happening in the Uyghur region. But since 2016, it's not possible anymore. But we have luckily we have few former camp survivors out of China. They giving detailed information about the what's happening in the camp. Also, those relatives who lived abroad, they have their family members' information they share with us, and some leaked document also. So we investigate gathering all those information.
And what you describe reminds me of the Cold War situation behind the Iron Curtain, when the Soviet Union was completely locked down. People were not getting out. And there were these Helsinki committees formed underground, and they were able, it was the pre-cyber age, so nobody had computers or social media, but they were able to somehow smuggle out these handwritten testimonies about their experiences or what the documentation they were taking down, and everyone was able to find out what the real story was, the human rights story, the total repression behind the scenes that wasn't apparent, wouldn't otherwise really be apparent to the outside world. So it sounds like with the advocacy groups, the relatives networks, the Uyghurs and the other ethnic minorities have in China have been able to take down this information, these cases, case by case, and let us know about it. I have so many questions. One point I want to make is that in our first part of this series, Miles Yu, who is my colleague at Hudson Institute, who's also was the principal advisor on China to Secretary Pompeo when he first made the genocide declaration, said that the United States knew about this situation inside of Xinjiang for years, but did not say anything about genocide because, and this is really was amazing revelation, is that the lawyers at State Department did not want to interfere with the diplomatic relations with between the United States and China. So that's I'm glad they broke through that and that it has been recognized. I think that's the first step of justice, is to recognize what you're going through, what a people's going through, a genocide being the most heinous of all human rights crimes. I wanted to ask you, what you're saying about this important witness from abroad. Is this why, from Uyghurs who escaped or who have relatives, is this why the black jails that Gordon referred to in the UAE and elsewhere, is this why they're, or deportations or the red alerts from Interpol, is this why they're so intense, the CCP is so intent on getting people back? Because when you think about it, they don't want the Uyghurs in their country. They don't want the religion, the ethnic group. They don't want this community at all. Why would they go to the trouble of arresting them and either extrajudicially or through Interpol and getting them back? Is that primarily to silence them and to?
Yes, of course. Right now, every Uyghur, witnessing this genocide and the targeting by Chinese government just because of their identity. Any Uyghurs for them is enemy. Just me, I am a Uyghur journalist in America. I'm an American citizen. As a journalist, for simply doing my job of reporting about what's happening in the Uyghur region, Chinese government has sent at least 24 members of my family to the camp and accused me being a terrorist and put me on their wanted list just because of exposing and reporting of this genocide.
So you really have been targeted and paid a price for what you're doing to tell the world about what's happening in the region. It's
necessary. It's necessary because we are talking about more than 3 million of people. And especially thinking about those children, forced separation from their parents.
Yeah, there have been hundreds of thousands of children taken away from their families, and I think it was 900 Thousand?
Just a number we could, imagine, but we never know what's the real number. No way to find out right now. So imagine in one family, both parents and whole family members being, interned to the camps. How about those children? Where are they gonna go? Who's gonna taking care of them? Chinese government already established, already have planned how to run these camps. Along with they building the camps, they build together the orphanage houses by the Chinese government's fund. And other thing is crematory centers. So we cannot just jump in the conclusion, but according to several groups says the organ harvesting is a real thing in the China, because when they arrest Uyghur people, first do is collecting their DNA and do health report about them. So it's like organ bank. Some of the human rights organizations say.
That's a perfect segue, Gulchera, into our next speaker, because Ethan Gutman has spent years writing about and analyzing the situation on organ harvesting. And
yes,
so
he's the expert.
So why don't we pause there, and we can have a general discussion later. But Ethan, can you tell us about your work as a reporter for many years, decades, on organ harvesting and other issues regarding China?
Let me jump right into what Gulchera is talking about here, because she's the one who came up with the crematorium information, which of course is fascinating. Now I want to make one case, which is the value of witnesses is extremely, just start with that. The value of witnesses cannot be overestimated. For example, that crematorium, one of the ones that we have found, she found really, Gulchera did through a witness who was in that camp briefly. We found an existing crematorium in Aksu province, and it's right there next to the two camps. One is 33,000 people approximately, one is 16,000 people approximately, and less than a kilometer away to the north is this large crematorium. All right, well, I was investigating in Turkey on forced labor of Uyghurs, but I happened to run into two fellows in Ankara who were both from Aksu. And I asked them just while we were talking about forced labor and their experiences in prison and so forth. I said, you ever drive by this place, this area? Oh yeah, all the time. Well, it turns out we had been assuming, or the BBC, I'd been talking to them, they'd been assuming this was a water-based crematorium system because it seems to have pipes connected to it. Well, it turns out, no, there's a terrible stench coming from that because both of these people reported the smell of kind of human hair or bones burning. Well, that means that the system is approximately can burn about 5 times the amount of bodies that we imagine. Now, we still don't know how many bodies are there, but that's a significant finding. In other words, it's not a normal crematorium. It's a high volume crematorium, extremely high volume. We don't know what the other 9 crematoriums that Gulchera discovered, but we know that they're out there. I'll give you another example of how important witnesses are. Human Rights Watch came out with that business on the DNA. They said, everybody's been tested, and all the Uyghurs in Xinjiang have been tested for their DNA. And they said, this is about surveillance. It's an invasion of privacy. These people are being, they can be tracked down through their DNA. Well, I've done a lot of interviews, more interviews probably with people from the camps than any other person on this planet right now, at least that I know. And I asked them all about those tests. Most of them don't describe a DNA test at all. They describe a blood test. It's that simple. They were given blood tests, and those blood tests are compatible, as are the DNA tests, but the blood tests in particular are compatible with tissue typing. That is matching the organ, matching their organs to some person who might need an organ. That's a pretty significant difference in the interpretation. Yeah.
So these
And
are all pieces of the puzzle to
they're pieces of
paint a
the puzzle.
picture
I don't
of
believe
mass
anything.
extermination.
Okay, I do not believe anything until I've really heard it from a witness. I mean, I need to have that backup. It's very important. Now, what, you know, there's been amazing work done, and obviously Adrian Zenz and other people have done great work with Chinese documents, and they've been snuck out. But I have been doing this for a long time. I've always relied on field research. I think it's really important. And we are facing a completely different world now, a much more difficult world in terms of the witnesses. There's a reason why that's important. Again, those documents are going to dry out. That is not going to, we're not going to see this flood of documents. That was a temporary procedure. The Chinese are going to stop putting things in documents. That's exactly what happened with organ harvesting. You can go back to the beginning of the organ harvesting world, and you can find all kinds of documents and doctors discussing exactly the age they like to harvest the person, where their organs are the freshest and best, which is 28 years old. We can find this in the medical literature. That's all gone. That's disappeared. We can't even find out how many, an individual hospital, how many organs it harvests per year, because we put out a report in 2016. The Chinese may make a mistake once, they may make it twice, but they will not make it a third time. Okay, it will never happen. Okay,
So they're not even revealing, they're hiding what you're describing is they're hiding circumstantial evidence now.
Absolutely.
Not just the crime itself, but actually the circumstantial evidence where you've been able to piece together in the past what is actually happening.
That's right. And the slaughter, my last book, was really mostly about Falun Gong, though partially about Uyghurs, but mainly about Falun Gong. On that one, I had over 100 witnesses. This book that I'll be coming out with this year, hopefully by the end of the year, will have about 25, okay? Maybe 30. It was very hard to get to them. It's very dangerous to them now. That wasn't the case before. It used to be I'd travel around the world. I'd go to Hong Kong, I'd go to Thailand, I'd go to Australia, I'd go where the refugees had ended up. Now, this is the great game all over again. You know, the great game in Central Asia. I mean, this is a world where you are not a human rights investigator, you're a spy. You essentially have to be a spy to operate. So you do not get the witnesses in trouble. So even in Kazakhstan, and I won't even talk about what I did this year yet, but because there are still some people back there. But in Kazakhstan, I drove from Germany to all the way to Almaty. Why? Because there was no way they would think of a reporter coming in with skis on their car with a beautiful daughter, you know, wearing funny hats and having watercolors and books on the snow leopard on the Caspian Sea ferry. There's no way. And then there was one other reason, because once we got into the country, we stopped using all devices. We relied on a map and a compass to get to Almaty, because you disappear electronically. And the Kazakhs are like the Chinese, are very, very dependent on using the methods, electronic methods and electronic methods only to a certain extent. They don't use informers so much. Other Central Asian states use informers. But that's what you have to do, this kind of incredibly complex work. Now, it's interesting work, and I think my literary agent is kind of happy I did it because she thinks it's really interesting. I think her only regret is that I didn't get thrown in prison for a night, because that would make the book much more salient. Okay, but you know, truthfully, and I don't mind it completely either, though there's always a period where I sort of have to go through a little bit of trauma afterwards when it kind of hits me what some of the risks we were taking.
So do you think that Ethan, do you think that this UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is going to come back with anything if she does go? I mean, China is now saying that it will let her in after the Olympics, but not for an investigation, only for an exchange.
What is the Potemkin village? What is the point of the Potemkin village at this point? There is none. There has not been for years, and the UN has fallen for it every time. Even the BBC, as much as I respect the fact that they did a very good story on rape among the Uyghur women. In fact, those were women I'd interviewed, and I pointed them towards those women. because I had interviewed those women with their husbands and they couldn't talk about it with me. And they were able to get these women away from their husbands, and so they could talk freely or felt that they could, and they came out with it. That's an amazing story. But let's talk about the story before that for a second. It featured Uyghurs dancing because that's what the Chinese showed them. And they thought, oh, well, we've got this close up and it shows the guy who's obviously got a black eye. Nobody saw that. People saw the Uyghurs dancing. This was, a terrible, terrible misuse of access. Okay, access is not, this is not the access we need. The access we need are the witnesses who are in Turkey, the witnesses who are in Kazakhstan, the witnesses who are in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Okay, these are the people we need to talk to.
So the old maxim that there's no substitute for a journalist or correspondent on the ground inside the country doesn't really make sense. It's really outdated.
There's many ways. I think the very good point the Aiton made. Yeah, witnesses we already have. We have to value all those witnesses, putting their lives and their family members in danger, still speaking out.
Yeah.
So they giving us very, very detailing information. And I would love to remind other researchers or investigation members, you have to pay attention any kind of information out of the Uyghur region. For example, the people very smart way to using TikTok video or other Chinese social media, just showing their family members' picture and crying, doesn't say anything. You can imagine, and they use only emoji like characters, like showing their emotions. They put in years, like for example, in 2016, there were 4 people in the picture. You can imagine they are a happy family. And in 2017, they put sad face and crying face, and only 3 members in the picture.
Wow.
So one is gone. So after
what about that, Co-Chair? What about that fantastic example where people filmed themselves doing forced labor? They were digging trenches and they put this glamorous music over it so that it would pass through the TikTok filters. It's one of the only shots we've ever got of people doing forced labor in Xinjiang. It's very important. And it shows you can see that people are young, they're being used this way. It's very significant. And we just had a few more of those pictures of cotton. Okay, we could have Nike out of business on this whole. I mean, this is the problem. We are looking at a situation where the young people, the 18-year-olds are being used for forced labor. They're being exploited for it. The 28-year-olds are being used for organ harvesting. They're being exploited for it. These are the 2 worst ages to be if you are a Uyghur, okay? 18 or 28. And there are different, and there are medical companies, which we don't know the names of, or we're not as familiar with, who are also exploiting the same thing, just the way Nike is exploiting the forced labor of the Uyghurs. And these are the issues that really have to come out. And this business with the Potemkin village of somebody coming in and sort of saying, "Oh, I talked to some people in the camp in some official capacity," it is utterly distracting and useless at this point, in my opinion.
Yeah, Ethan, have you looked into this UN WHO World Health Organization task force on organ harvesting and what happened? What's going on with that? I mean, that's an amazing story. Can you give us a thumbnail sketch of that, of what that's all about?
I don't know. I mean, you turn what happened with COVID around and run it backwards, and that's basically what happened with the WHO.
Well, it was there's a task force against organ harvesting or trafficking of organs that was actually founded by a member of the CCP council, Central Committee of the CCP, Dr. Huang. And I think his name is Jeffu Wang, and Huang. And he actually sits on the task force and manipulates. It's unbelievable.
What's behind that? What's behind that is the Transplantation Society of America. Now, what's their I think some of them are quite sincere. They feel that we've made friends in China. We would like to do research with them and so forth. And I don't deny that. But most of them, there's a financial interest in it. Okay. I'm not saying the specific members. I'm not pointing to anybody that specifically. As a matter of fact, one of the main guys is I think very wealthy and doesn't probably even need the money, but maybe he does. I don't know. But the point is, there are immense amounts of anti-rejection drugs that are being sold to China. It's a captive audience. Okay.
Well, there's lots of medical institutions that are have exchanges that train transplant doctors.
Absolutely. Robotics have been sold. There's actually, we have come up with a kidney machine, an extraction machine. We've sold that to China. That's a lot of money. Now, it's true. It's only a lot of money for a little while because they'll copy it and counterfeit it, and then it'll be.
But they don't. The American public does not even know about this yet. They don't, let alone American medical collaboration. They don't know the atrocity of organ harvesting.
Well, they've done a very effective job. The medical world has done a very effective job of blocking both the press and the political side. The legacy press is scared to cover this because they're scared that they're sort of buying into some conspiracy theory. They can't get many doctors to come out and sort of say, no, this is really going on.
Chair, do you want to, can you tell us what's going on with it? With this organ harvesting, because it's affecting Uyghur. It started out with Falun Gong in massive numbers. These are offshoot of Buddhism that does spiritual practices, and now we're hearing more about the Uyghurs being targeted.
Eaton and the Dr. Anwar Tokhti did very, very good research about that. First, Anwar Tokhti point out he witnessed the Uyghur prisoners were targeted by Chinese government just for the organ harvesting since 1997. It was a huge incident in the Ili. So thousands of Uyghurs was jailed, and mysteriously, no information about them. We don't know what happened to them, disappeared. So after that, we paying attention to this crime, and I talked to many, as many as 15 camp survivors, including Uyghur and the Kazakh and others. They all saying first, after they being arrested, all went to hospital, specific government-run hospital to blood test, to health test. Then they cutting their hair very shortly. Uyghurs have, mostly Uyghur people, Uyghur women have long hair. Even Chinese government benefiting from the hair. Already, for example, 2 years ago, CBP, in the US border, there was 13 tons of human hair come from Xinjiang.
13 tons,
Selling hair for wigs.
Yes. And many other issues, we still couldn't figure it out, And the witnesses says, and the camp survivors says they've been using daily some kind of medicine in the camp. And we don't know who's the provider of this, medicine, what kind of medicine they've been using, for what. And we talking about millions of people. It's tons amounts of, medicine every day they have to use on those camps for the millions of people. But we still couldn't find out what kind of medicine they've been using, and who was the provider, and what kind of machines they've been using for, to check those people, and where they were imported from, all those equipment, and many other things. How about the food? How about the other clothes, other things? and Chinese government still benefiting from the concentration camp.
Yeah, can I put some figures on that for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because this is, okay, so for example, an average human being who's 28, 29 years old, somewhere between 25 to 35, who's healthy, can be sold, the parts of their body can basically be sold for $500,000 easily. If it's to Japanese or to Gulf state, to organ tourists, it can be up to $1 million. This is phenomenal numbers. We didn't see this. There was nothing like this in the Holocaust. There were attempts to make soap out of bodies and use, similar to what Lucero was talking about. There was wig production or using hair to stuff mattresses and so forth. This is pretty direct stuff. I am estimating, based on the witnesses that I interviewed in Kazakhstan, and they were all from different camps, every single one of them. But it was always 2.5 to 5% of the people disappear in a single year. And they're all about 28 years old, to simply disappear. That number is about 25 to 50,000 if you accept that it's 1 million people in the camps. That's a pretty low estimate, but let's go with it. It's 25 to 50,000 every year. Now, there's been a lot of talk about genocide, but the fact is, this is the most direct form of it. I don't see that it's clear that it's a dual purpose solution. Like many things in China, there's a profit motive, but there's also a political motive, and they're both being run out simultaneously. This is a population which is extremely vulnerable, which absolutely has no contact really with the outside world, except for a few people who are able to get a message maybe to Kulchera or somebody like that. And there is no recourse of any kind. But yet we know that these figures, 25 to 50,000 per year, is almost exactly what China needs to continue at about 60,000 organ transplants a year, or maybe even 100,000. And that's where we think the numbers have been for some time. That's the transplant volume of China.
Ethan,
go ahead, Gordon.
Jeffrey Nice, the London barrister, had his organ harvesting tribunal. Do you know where he got his information?
Well, he interviewed every major expert. Every major expert testified at the organ harvesting at the China Tribunal, including me, and every single one in the world. They went through the literature exhaustively. I think one of the disappointments of the Uyghur Tribunal is they sort of tried to put a fence around the organ harvesting issue, and I would like to say something about that. And it's a little controversial, but I'm going to.
Just to give a little background, there are two international people's tribunals that took place in the UK. They were both headed by the same chair, Sir Nice. And they had one, the China Tribunal was on organ harvesting in particular, and they determined that they just didn't have enough evidence to say it was genocide. They thought it was crimes against humanity, which has less emotional impact, I think, and governments are less likely to respond to that. And it really I think, let Beijing off the hook.
I wouldn't say that the report was very strong. In fact, some of the language was stronger than the Uyghur report. Look, that's one of the problems.
Let me just say that the Uyghur report was a genocide determination the Uyghurs were, but it had a brief examination of a brief statement on organ harvesting, saying they just were waiting actually for Ethan, for your information, I think, for your report that you're doing.
That was
okay, you can respond in 1 second, but I just wanted to say that the China Tribunal against on organ harvesting made the conclusion, or they raised the issue that this could be merely a motive, an intent to make money. And that's the intent is a very important element of the crime of genocide under the International Convention. So they have to have an intent to partially destroy a population. And they said, well, maybe it was just to make money. But I think that you're right. I just want to say, I think you're right that there's a range of actors in this whole and Gulcher laid this out for us, there's a range of actors in
No.
in this business, this industry of organ harvesting. There you had the medical professionals, but you also have the prisons, you also have the
There's only one
CCP,
person.
also
There's
the
only
state.
no, wait a minute. There's
Now,
only one
now,
person
Ethan,
on
you can
that
speak your
panel.
piece.
Okay, look, that panel, there was only one person who was making that point, which I thought was a frivolous and ridiculous idea. You can't walk and chew gum at the same time. You can't make a profit and kill the state's enemies at the same time.
influence
That's
their
what China
decision?
does. But that's because that person is the person who did that, who is a doctor, is ignorant of communism. They don't understand. Communism always does a dual purpose.
Well, whether
There's
he was
always
or
a
not, did he influence the decision of the
She-
tribunal?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was my
Absolutely.
point.
And they-
That's my point.
And
That
no,
was
I
the,
mean, look, I like Jeffrey Nice very much. I like most of the people in that panel, but I'll tell you, they really they punted on this one. They punted, and they punted because they had a doctor who really shouldn't have been on that panel. Okay, because there are too many vested interests in the medical world right now. in
there's a
this area.
conflict of interest.
Exactly. And she shouldn't, I think we talked about that off piece one time, didn't we, Nina?
Yeah, we did.
And you, I think you made that point, and I think that's absolutely right. And I don't think they thought about it that way, but I think there's been a misunderstanding of how, in a sense, corrupted or, how we can look at this after what's happened with the WHO and this fiasco with COVID. And them lying for China and all the rest of it, how people can be looking at this as, well, the medical world is somehow sacrosanct and, I trust my family doctor, therefore I trust. I don't think most people feel that way anymore. And I don't think they should. The medical world is deeply corrupt and deeply defensive, and it circles the wagons every time there's even a breath of scandal. Okay.
Well, there's a lot vested in exchanges and grants and projects and research and publications and so forth. And China has, it's terrible, but it's state of the art, dominating the field of organ transplants now because it uses live donors involuntarily, we think.
I mean, it's one last thing about that. This business about intent. I'm sorry, if you really draw that out, is if a successful rape requires a sexual intent, okay? So how do we separate out those things? One thing is an attack and assault on another human being. Another part of it is the sexual satisfaction. You're telling me you can absolutely draw them out and say it's one thing or the other? That's ridiculous.
Well, it's another example of plausible denial that China, through its deceptive practices, and it's also manipulation and controlling the narrative, as Gordon said at the beginning, that allows people who don't want to see to not see. And we're running out of time, and so I just wanted to ask a last question to each of you. Whether you think, the Olympics, the argument for holding the Olympics in Beijing, despite an ongoing genocide that we do know about the Uyghurs, the Olympics is going to make a world a more peaceful, better place, improve understanding. The Secretary General of the UN had told Secretary of State Blinken in the United States when they entered office a year ago, put aside your differences on human rights and let's focus on the things that we can, get along on. Setting aside human genocide, Uyghur genocide, he meant, because it came out a week after the prior Secretary of State made the determination. Gordon, what do you think? Is this going to improve relations, make it a better place?
What the Olympics have done is to legitimize the Chinese Communist Party in general, but it's also it takes place and it diminishes this whole notion of genocide. Remember, the United States and China are parties to the Genocide Convention of 1948, and the activities of China constituted genocide as defined in Article 2 of the convention. And Article 1 requires states to prevent and to punish acts of genocide. And that's not happening. You can't allow China to continue this. So really what we have is China is a win from the Olympics, just by the mere fact that it's being held there. because it says that issues of genocide should not affect, this is what holding the Olympics there, holding the Olympics should not affect this whole notion of genocide, that genocide can continue. You know, as Ethan was talking about, you can't separate out things. Well, you can't separate this out either. And so holding the games there was wrong. And we can see this from all sorts of various aspects of it. This is just the most horrific things that we have seen since the end of World War II. And what China is doing right now is comparable to the Third Reich's atrocities prior to the mass exterminations of 1941. It's not that people aren't dying in those camps. They are, as Ethan has talked about with the crematoria. It's just that they are not dying in mass exterminations the way that the Third Reich committed them. But people are dying in great numbers. And the fact of the crematoria tells us that this is one of the most ghastly things in human history.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. We're out of time, but I do want to thank you all for this discussion. I think it's very important. I think that we should keep our focus on China. I know you three will, as I will. And I urge our viewers to boycott the Olympics. And also, I think that we need to keep pressure on the International Olympic Committee to reform or be disbanded, and through our own governments. But again, thank you very much. If any of our viewers would like to see the other parts in this series, please again go to www.hudson.org.